I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. By the end of the 19th century, the city of Galveston, located on a barrier island off the southeast coast of Texas, had become a thriving commercial center and one of the busiest ports in the United States. Sadly, that all changed on September 8, 1900, when a catastrophic hurricane roared into Galveston from the Gulf of Mexico with heavy rain, powerful winds, and a deadly storm surge. The storm resulted in the deaths of between 6,000 and 8,000 people and the destruction of thousands of homes and businesses. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we will be speaking with J.R. Shaw, the creator of Galveston Unscripted, podcast and audio tour. J.R., a native of Galveston, has a passion for researching and sharing history and will be taking us back to that fateful time in September of 1900 to give us a glimpse into what is still known as the deadliest natural disaster in the history of the United States. I'd now like to welcome J.R. Shaw to our show. Welcome, J.R.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, we're glad to have you on the show. And we are about to talk about an incredible, terrible event that happened in Galveston, Texas, back in 1900. Before we talk about that, though, I want to ask you a little bit about your background. What are your ties to Galveston? And what can you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, so I was born in Galveston. It's kind of funny. My parents both met here in Galveston, but neither one of them are from here. But I was born here in Galveston back in 1991 and kind of grew up between Galveston and Texas City, which is right across Galveston Bay. And as a, growing up here, always knew it had some historical significance to Texas and American history. But one story that was always talked about growing up was, of course, the 1900 storm. But a little bit about myself. I, of course, grew up here and then ended up going to college here on the island. Went to Texas A&M at Galveston and quickly got into the maritime industry, which is shipping and all the business related to shipping, naturally being in Galveston. Worked in Galveston and Houston for about 9.5 years before I got into podcasting. History podcasting mainly. So have a history podcast called Galveston Unscripted based in Galveston. And we cover Texas, American, and Galveston history. So there's a little bit about myself and what I'm doing now.
Your podcast is fantastic. I binge watched a couple weeks ago and I thoroughly enjoyed the information that you bring to your listeners, watchers. So terrific work. So probably about 15 years ago, somebody recommended a book to me called Isaac's Storm. It was written by a very famous author, Eric Larson. Picked up the book and I couldn't put it down. It was just so interesting. I was a history major in college and sadly, I don't think I ever read about it or heard about this hurricane, which I found out was the largest or worst natural disaster on American soil. Is that true?
Yes, it's absolutely true. One of the deadliest natural disasters to happen in the United States, even to this day. In Galveston alone, it's estimated that over 6,000 to 8,000 people were killed just on the island alone. And in 1900 had a population of 37,000, so a significant portion of the population. But of course, that storm continued on into Texas and up into America and continued to devastate throughout Texas and even up into Canada, which is really kind of fascinating, even into the Atlantic. But yeah, so it extremely devastating storm. And, it's really funny. A lot of people I talk to, especially when I travel, that is either the only thing they know about Galveston or they've never heard of it. So it's kind of funny.
I had read the book about the Johnstown flood by David McCullough. So I knew about that. I mean, you could argue that yeah, it was a natural disaster, but there was a lot of negligence involved there. But there were, I forget, 2,000, maybe 3,000 people who were affected by that or killed, I should say. But the Galveston hurricane really was so much bigger than that. So when I read this book and I was learning about not just about the actual hurricane that hit, but about Galveston's history, but also about weather forecasting techniques back in 1900 and really how far we've come since then. So the date that the storm made landfall was September 8th, 1900. Can you give us an idea of what Galveston, the city, was like in 1900, and maybe talk about it geographically as well?
Absolutely. I'll start with the geography first because that's the most important. It's really what made Galveston what it was into 1900, even today. So yeah, Galveston is located in the southeast portion of Texas. It's an island about 2 miles off of the coast of Texas. So it's kind of funny. People who live here today, they talk about Galveston as not even being attached to the United States, leaving the United States when you cross that causeway. So of course, an island, and it has a natural, even before they dredged the ship channel, had a natural deep water protected bay where ships could come and go. So even back in the early 1800s, even prior to that, but really in the early 1800s, settlements started to pop up here in Galveston, mainly by pirates, which is kind of interesting, but a really fascinating history there. I won't go down that rabbit hole today. But those pirates along the Spanish and Mexican coast of Texas really started to build settlements here into the 1820s. Once the pirates ran out, over the next 20 years or so, Galveston was just growing very slowly. After the Texas Revolution, Galveston, the official city of Galveston, was founded in 1839. And from 1839 until the Civil War, Galveston, the port of Galveston, was growing and expanding. A lot of ships were coming in and out of Galveston as Texas was expanding. So as more settlers were coming into Texas, cities are being built all throughout the state. Galveston's expanding because of the natural deep water port. Of course, the Civil War happens. Cotton is a major export for the Confederacy. So Galveston was, of course, a Confederate port for the entirety of the Civil War. And cotton was one, like I was saying, one major funder of the Confederacy, but also a major economic driver after the Civil War. So into the 1870s through the 1890s, Galveston's port was growing. So growing like tremendously. So 20, 30, 40% per year. So you see huge buildings being built downtown, tons of people moving here. Just a lot of stuff was going on through the 1870s to the 1890s here in Galveston, making Galveston one of the richest cities per capita in the United States, which is really fascinating to think about. And even up until 1890, it was the most populous city in Texas. So when we think of Galveston today, if you look at it on a map, right, it's just a little island with a population of about 50,000. But at this point in the 1890s, it was one of the largest cities in Texas. So let's jump to 1900, right? Galveston has a couple ways to get on and off the island. That one of them is a rail ferry headed towards Bolivar, kind of towards Beaumont, that goes east towards Louisiana. And then another one is a rail line that goes straight up to Houston, which is about an hour drive today. It's about 50 miles. And they had, in 1900, they had daily rail services to and from Houston. Same thing with the rail ferry and everything over going to Beaumont. There were people moving to Galveston, immigrating in here constantly, immigrating into Texas, but a lot of immigrants ended up staying here. Galveston was the second largest immigration port, only to Ellis Island, up until 1900 and even a little bit after. So that just gives you an idea of all the things that were going on here. So tons of people moving here. Back up a little bit. Galveston was the first city in Texas with electricity, with phones, first post office, one of the first military bases. You name it, the Texas firsts, it has almost all of them. So Galveston was a major, major city. And of course, in 1900, not much had changed. It was still a major economic driver for the state of Texas, as well as beach tourism, which had really started growing in the 1880s up until 1900. Tons of bathhouses out on the beach, which, of course, as we're going to talk about momentarily, that storm coming through, you can imagine 8 feet above sea level is not enough to keep your entire city or island from flooding. So hopefully I covered that for you.
You covered that very, very well. JR, you mentioned about bathhouses and bathing and things like that. Wasn't it relatively new for people to go swimming in the ocean back in the 1890s in that period?
Yeah, but it's kind of funny. Of course, the locals in Galveston, they would go swimming in the ocean all the time, but bathing suits were not. Well, you couldn't just go to Walmart or Target or wherever and buy a bathing suit. Back in the 1800s, a lot of people would wear full-on clothes in the ocean a lot of times, or just go, naked sometimes, depending on where you were. But in the 1880s, as Galveston was growing and became kind of this destination, daily rail lines and things like that, people would come down from Houston to go enjoy the beach. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs, they were like, oh, what we could do is we could rent bathing suits and sell things on the beach for these day trippers or weekend trippers, you name it. And they had kind of got the idea from a little place called Atlantic City. And then, so up there in New Jersey, and some of those bathhouses that were up there in New Jersey and along the East Coast, there were bathhouses up there for 30, 40, 50 years prior to what Galveston was doing. So, so they built these gigantic bathhouses out on the beach. And I'm going to send you some photos so maybe you can layer in here to see how extravagant these bathhouses were, that people could come down, rent a bathing suit. When they were finished, they could rinse off, they could buy food and, do whatever, change and everything in these bathhouses. But that was a huge shift for Galveston, because prior to these bathhouses, Galveston did not want to be known as a resort town. They wanted to be known as the big city, the big economic capital, basically, of the state. One thing I didn't mention earlier, 5 of the state's largest banks were located on the Strand, which is the main drag closest to the port, main city street, main downtown area. The businessmen in Galveston, the city government and everything, they wanted to be known as this big city, right? They didn't want to be known as a resort town. But anyway, entrepreneurs prevailed and built these big bathhouses out on the beach. So you really had a diversity in the economy through the 1880s to 1900. So,
yeah, I'm thinking about that. So you do have leisure. You've got the bathhouses, but also you've got banking, and you've got thriving businesses going. The population is increasing. You've got the deepwater port. I mean, it just sounds like Galveston was the place to be at the turn of the century.
It really was one of the premier cities on the Gulf Coast and the United States. It was Galvestonians and historians, they kind of put it on a pedestal with the San Francisco, the New Orleans, like that size city, but with that economic significance to their states, deepwater ports and things like that.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Just to back up a bit, is that I have a photograph of my grandfather on the beach in Atlantic City, 1899, with who was then his girlfriend. It became his first wife, actually, who ended up passing away. But they were on the beach, and he had the top on his bathing suit, and it went down to about his knees, I guess. And she had like a full blown dress on, like
yes.
It was crazy. And it looked, I don't know, it wasn't in color, obviously, but it looked like they were black or dark. So they would have really absorbed that sun on the beach,
Right? Yeah. And that's one thing, I didn't mention these bathing suits. A lot of them were made from cotton or wool. Wool was really common to make a bathing suit out of. So you imagine trying to swim in the rough surf in a wool, full body, basically bathing suit. I mean, I can't imagine that.
That's horrendous. I think how many people went under that never found them again, right?
Well, we'll talk about lifeguarding history some other time.
So this paints the picture of what Galveston was like before the storm. So let's talk about the storm. And before we do that, let's talk about the science at the time. Where was meteorology at that point with regard to detecting or forecasting weather, and particularly bad weather like a hurricane?
So of course, I'm not a meteorologist. I'll just state that now. But so my understanding of forecasting was really just data collection and being able to relay a message. And of course, telegraphs existed at that time. So really forecasting was not nearly as advanced as we have it today, where we are using satellite imagery. We are using all kinds of data points to forecast not only hurricanes, but even thunderstorms and you name it. Back in 1900, really what you could collect was the barometer readings, which was really just barometric pressure, as well as temperature, and maybe a few other things like cloudy, wind is blowing out of the southeast. And that was kind of the case all over the Gulf Coast. And what you would have to really rely on for hurricane forecasting was communication, telegraphing, and things like that. One very important thing to note is that there were telegraphs through the 1880s, 1890s into 1900, but there was not ship-to-shore communication. So this is very important. Of course, we hear about like the Titanic and things like that a few years after the 1900 storm, where they had some ship-to-shore communication, very limited, but there was not in 1900. So the only way you would hear about a storm, even in the Atlantic, is if a sailor had sailed near a storm or through a storm and then arrived somewhere in Florida or even into Texas, wherever. And they said, oh, by the way, there was a big storm. Oh, what direction do you think it was heading? Oh, it was going, northwest, and that was really it when you're at sea. But that ties kind of into a major problem with this storm in particular, the 1900 storm. Of course, we had weather stations all over the Gulf Coast, even in Cuba. Now, 1900 was just a couple years after the Spanish-American War, which caused a major conflict between the Cuban officials and Cuban weather officials and the United States Weather Bureau, where they were not really trusting or kind of neglecting these weather reports coming out of Cuba. So the 1900 storm, very important to note, it, of course, came across the Atlantic, crossed over Cuba, just wiped out Cuba, which is a story that I don't think is told enough, in my opinion, but wiped out Cuba. And the Cuban weather officials desperately tried to telegraph the United States Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., and say, hey, by the way, a storm just crossed over Cuba into the Gulf of Mexico. They were kind of neglecting these messages. Now, in Florida, just 90 to 100 miles away, they were seeing signs of a storm. Now, unfortunately, they assumed that the storm had crossed over Cuba and then gone back out into the Atlantic, if you can imagine, kind of like we see the spaghetti models today, crossing over Cuba and then back up into the Atlantic, going northeast again. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The storm crossed over Cuba, straight into the Gulf of Mexico, and there was no way of knowing, the Galvestonians, there was no way of knowing there was a storm in the Gulf of Mexico, which is why it was such a surprise when it landed on September 8th, 1900.
Yeah, and I think about, before these communication techniques, I think people looked at the clouds and looked for certain signs from nature and all that, but perhaps there was the fact that there was some advancement, but not much, maybe gave people some false assurance. I understand some of the weather people, like the book Isaac Storm is about Isaac Klein, who was the head meteorologist in Galveston at that time, according to the book by Larson. So wasn't there the thought that a storm such as the one that hit in 1900 could not happen to Galveston?
Yes, and this is a very interesting thing. Even Isaac Klein himself, who was the chief of the National Weather Bureau or National Weather Service in Texas, when he arrived in Galveston, he wrote an essay, and I believe it was published in the newspaper, stating that Galveston was not prone to major hurricanes that were slamming into Louisiana and slamming into Mexico and slamming into southern Texas because of its geographical location, which kind of tarnished a little bit. It looks really bad now that we know what happened, but it kind of put a little bad mark on Isaac Klein's name. But as we know today, none of that was true. Galveston is as prone to hurricanes as any other location in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm really not exactly sure why he would have stated that, but evidently it was a thought at the time. Now, one thing we know today is there were major hurricanes slamming into Galveston, even back into the 1820s through the early 1830s. There were hurricanes hitting all the time at the pretty similar frequency that we get today. Now, did Isaac Klein know that Jean Lafitte, the pirate, dealt with a major hurricane in 1820? I don't think so. But it's just one of those things.
Wasn't there talk, or was there ever talk about building a seawall before the storm?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm really glad you brought that up. Indianola, which is was a little port town about 100 miles southwest of Galveston, was wiped out twice in the 1870s and in the 1880s, completely decimating the town. And after that storm, there was talk of building some sort of protection from the sea, hurricanes, or storm surge. But for whatever reason, it was struck down within city government, or funding. The funding was just too outrageous to be able to build, or the thought to build something that could protect Galveston like we have today, which we'll talk about a little later. But there was talk about building some sort of seawall or protective mechanism. But for whatever reason, it was not accepted or built.
Because I'm thinking the highest level you said was 8 feet. That's pretty vulnerable to any kind of storm surge that would come in. Let's talk about the storm when it hit. There was really no advanced warning. I mean, I know Isaac Klein saw some signs, but it was really, really late in the process. Can you tell us about the storm and what it physically did when it came ashore?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with Friday, September 7th. On the morning of Friday, September 7th, Isaac Klein received a notification from the Weather Bureau in DC, and it basically gave an outline of every other report along the Gulf Coast. And there was really no indication of a major storm. There was an indication that there could be a storm in the Gulf, because they had finally heard, Cuba had, been devastated. But there could be a storm in the Gulf, but probably not, So the morning of Friday, September 7th, people in Galveston were starting to notice the really big waves that were starting to come ashore. And of course, we know now, maybe there's a big storm in the Gulf, but back then that was kind of a draw to go to the beach. So hundreds or thousands of people were going down to the shoreline to watch these giant waves start to crash onto the beach. And one thing Isaac noticed later on Friday was that the wind was blowing pretty heavily from the north. So blowing right offshore. But what was happening is the waves were crashing in and the wind was blowing this way. Now, what normally happens without a storm is that the waves start to kind of die down a little bit and even push the tide out slightly. So you kind of get a offshore wind, you get that tide starts to go out a little bit, or the water line does. But that was not what was happening. What Isaac Klein was witnessing was the initial storm surge from the hurricane that was bearing down right on Galveston. Now, Isaac Klein, he got these reports, but didn't really know what to do because there was no indication that from the weather service that there was a major, major storm happening. So there was, he didn't say anything or raise a storm flag or anything like that on Friday. So let's hop to overnight and then the morning of Saturday, September 8th. So the morning of Saturday, September 8th, Galvestonians wake up. Little did they know that was for 6,000 people at least, that was going to be the last time they woke up and slept soundly in their beds. The storm surge had, of course, risen, where now it looks like waves are just basically hitting the front of the houses that are along the beachfront. So extremely high tides, waves that are out, crazy, outrageous, giant waves are starting to crash against these buildings on the beach. And throughout the morning, the tide keeps coming in and coming in and coming in. And by noon, the water was already over most of the island. If you look at Galveston on the map, south of Broadway, a lot of that was underwater. So you're in knee-deep or waist-deep water in some places by noon on Saturday. So by this time, a lot of people understood there was a storm coming and it was going to get bad. The rain it was no longer just bands of rain coming in. It was sustained rain. And by 2:00, there was no way on or off the island. Of course, even if you wanted to evacuate 37,000 people on the island, you only had two ways off. One of which, the rail ferry, the tide was so high, they could no longer run that rail ferry. There was no way you could run that rail ferry because the tide was high enough you couldn't pull up the boat to the actual rail lines. And the other way off, you only had so many trains that were running from Houston. So the last train came down from Houston around noon or 1 o'clock. And that was the last connection to the mainland for the next couple months to be able to rebuild that ferry. But even the last communication they were going to have with the outside was that their last train that left Galveston on that day for the next few days. So people on the island, they're starting to hunker down. Wives are sending their eldest kids to go retrieve their husbands from work. And it's another important thing to note is a Saturday was a work day back then, right? You think of Saturday, having Saturday off if you have a normal job. Saturday was a work day. So a lot of people work till noon or 5 o'clock on Saturdays very often. So a lot of the husbands were downtown working and their wives and children were home, which unfortunately, for a lot of these people, the men would go downtown to these big brick structures, many of which survived the 1900 storm, and left their wife and kids at home. Many of those homes, of course, did not survive the storm. It's just, there's a lot going on with the storm here. So,
JR, you talked about Saturday being a work day, and even reading the book, Isaac Storm, you hear about people who are like, well, I'm going to work, because if you don't go to work and you lose your job, you were just like a one step away from the bill collectors and losing your house or what have you. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to work from home today.
Yeah,
hopefully I don't lose internet.
exactly.
These poor folks were they were literally poor folks. Many of them had to get out and work. They were going to go into work because if the other workers got there and they didn't, that was it. So one of the terrors that I think about when these folks were realizing now that this was really bad was that we're not together. Like, we need to get the family together. We're going to do this together. And that's one of the things that I saw come out of some of the stories. And what I imagine is the terror of not only the high winds, which I understood could be over 140 miles per hour, they estimate, because I hope I say this right, the anemometer.
Yeah, you got it.
On top of the weather building just blew off at one point, and they didn't really know how high it got, but the wind was high. But the biggest killer seemed to be the storm surge. Could you talk about how big that surge was and what kind of damage that did?
Absolutely. So it's safe to say that the storm surge was well over 8 feet, right? Because the highest point on the island was 8 feet, and that was completely covered. The storm surge is estimated to be somewhere between 15 and 20 feet above the ground level of Galveston Island. And if you look at just a house, a normal house, it has a second floor on it. That's easily above the first floor. So unfortunately, what was happening towards the beach side of the island, many of the homes were starting to get picked up off their foundations as the storm was really rolling in. The winds are starting to pick up, but that storm surge hits first. So the homes are starting to be picked up and lifted up off their foundations and starting to batter into other homes. So there are many firsthand accounts that elaborate on how some of these people, mainly women, were bringing in their cows and horses and chickens all into the house, getting their kids and everybody, their neighbors, whoever, maybe they had a sturdier house on their block than somebody else, they would get them all in the house. And as the storm surge was rising, they would take an axe and chop holes in their floors. And the theory behind that, which sometimes it worked, was the house was essentially a boat, right? So if you had the storm surge coming in, it could elevate that entire house and move it off the foundation. But if you chopped a hole in the floors, the water could come in and weigh down the house to keep it on the foundation or as close to the foundation. Just let the water in, because the water is going to come in anyway, but you want to keep your house where it is, because that's how quickly the water was rising on Saturday afternoon. So these women are chopping floors, the water's coming in and weighing down that house. If you had a second story, everybody would go up to the second story and kind of huddle in one of the sturdiest rooms they could find away from windows and things like that. it was a lot of these times without their husbands who are downtown working for the most part. Now, if you were to try to come home, you could do it depending on where your home was. You would basically be wading through water or swimming home. And there are many firsthand accounts of people trying to swim back home, climbing in trees and things like that. There are other firsthand accounts of men or people who were trying to swim downtown and ended up, they couldn't get home. The wind was too high, or the waves started to get pretty high, or there was so much debris in the water. They climbed in trees and survived the entire night of this hurricane hanging onto a branch on a tall oak tree, if they could find one, or swim into another house and just pray that, you could survive the night in that house. Now, another thing that was happening is as the evening started to come around, which has got to be horrifying, by the way. The storm is just hitting and really getting bad, and the sun goes down and you can't see anything. It's pitch black. As houses would collapse, let's say this house, which of course survived the 1900 storm, if this house collapsed and my family survived the collapse, the initial collapse, we would have to get out of the house and try to swim to another home or building or structure. And this was devastating because a lot of the children would get swept away or lost, or your wife would get swept away and you're holding on to the kids, and just a horrifying situation, but there was a lot going on with the storm surge. Now, another major killer of people from the wind perspective, of course, as we know, debris is a major issue. In 1885, there was a major fire that swept through the east end of the island. Now, one thing that came out of that is a lot of people put slate tiles on their roofs. Now, these slate tiles, they're basically stone. If you've ever seen slate, they're pretty hefty tiles, right? Now, the winds, as you were stating earlier, 140, 150, 180 mile an hour winds at some gusts, they're blowing these slate tiles off the roofs and flinging them through the air like razor sharp frisbees, and they're impaling people. And that was another major problem, because there were thousands of homes that these thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of slate tiles are just starting to fly through. So to even go to another house, try to swim to another house was, very difficult. Some of these firsthand accounts you read and even oral histories you hear, they are unimaginable. They truly are. But yeah, so into the evening, that storm surge is high. People are attempting to get out. People are already dying in their homes. Homes are collapsing, mainly towards the beach side.
I'm just trying to picture what it was like in some of these houses where, it could be that the husband was downtown and at that point maybe struggling to get back to his family, not knowing where they were. And, neighbors piling into the house, maybe a cow or something like that. I understand that the weather had been extremely hot in Galveston the week prior. So the damp, the heat, the crowd, the fear, the darkness is almost unimaginable for those people. And the sounds, reading the book of Isaac Storm, you can only imagine, your people are hearing these crashes and not knowing at what point their house is going to come off the foundations. And one of the things people seem to do is look out the window and want to see some other sign that there was somebody else out there, like a little glow of a lantern or a voice or something like that. And I think about these folks and what a dreadful event this was, and with no warning whatsoever, is just really scary. There's so many stories, but there's a couple I'd like you, if you could, talk about. And I hate to be so sad about this, but the fact is this was a terrible storm, and there were so many cases of courage and resourcefulness and just fortitude. But probably the most tragic story was about the orphanage that was down by the beach. Can you talk about that and the enormous courage that the sisters who ran that house had?
Absolutely. So to back it up a little bit, I want to talk about the orphanage and the orphanages here on the island, because this ties into another aspect of history that makes Galveston pretty unique. So Galveston had tons of orphanages. Just from where I'm sitting, there are two within 2 blocks from me. that were orphanages at one point, started in the 1870s. This goes back to the orphan trains. If whoever's listening, go look up the orphan trains. It's a really fascinating story where they would take orphans in northeastern cities like New York, Boston, things like that, and put them on a train and ship them out westward at least. Now, Galveston on these trains was the farthest south and west on that line. So the orphans who were not adopted along the train route, a lot of them ended up in Galveston. We had a lot of orphans is basically the point here. So St. Mary's Orphanage was built way out west. Even today, we Galvestonians on the East End consider 69th Street way out west. If you are familiar with Galveston, that is out where the Walmart is. It's literally on where the Walmart property is now. So St. Mary's Orphanage was built there, and I forget the exact year, but it was many years prior to the storm. It was built very, very close to the beach in thoughts that the warm sea air would help any sick children if they had a certain disease. They just thought fresh air and sea air would be beneficial to sick kids. So I believe there were 10 nuns, 10 sisters, and over 90 orphans in this orphanage during the storm of 1900. And as the sisters started to notice the water rising and getting higher, and to think about this, there was nowhere to run that far west because everything and every sturdy building that you could hide in, if you could, was way out east. And down here between 20th and 25th Street, they were down where 69th Street is today. So you didn't have cars, you didn't have buses. There was no way to get anyone down here. So what the sisters did is they moved everyone to the newest dormitory, or where all the kids slept, the newest one, the most sturdy one, and they tied clothesline around these kids. So the sisters would tie a clothesline either around their wrist or around their body, and then tie 6 to 7 kids to each of the sisters. Now, unfortunately, as the St. Mary's Orphanage, all the buildings ended up collapsing, there was no way for these kids to escape or the nuns to escape because they're all strung together. Debris would get caught inside these clotheslines and things like that. And only 3 boys were able to escape. Out of the 93 or so orphans and 10 sisters, only 3 boys were able to escape and survive the storm. And which is where we get the firsthand accounts and the story of how those nuns tried to survive and try to keep the kids alive. But there was no rescue, no escape, nowhere to go. And I forget the name of the song, but they sang a couple songs that were like the God of the Sea or something like that, or please quell the waves or something like that. But yeah, the firsthand accounts from those boys is really, really fascinating. But it is a sad story. The storms kill without prejudice. It doesn't matter who you are. I mean, it's just a very sad story.
Yeah, we do have those eyewitness accounts from those boys, but the only reason they survived is because they were free to grab onto things. I think they held onto a log or something, but the sisters were figuring, I'm in charge. I'm responsible for these children. I need to know where they are. I want us to stay together. There was that whole thing about staying together, and it just went wrong. But the intention was to keep them close so that they could save all of them. But did you have another one that you could share with us, or maybe a specific story? Do you have another one?
I do have a couple stories. One of them is, as women were in the water in this super high tide, the storm surge. I mean, this isn't flat pool water. This is very turbulent water. And if your head's above water, you're getting hit with debris. You're swimming through debris if you can swim. Now, all this debris in the water and all the debris you may run into is ripping off clothes. All this cotton clothing or linen or whatever you're wearing was getting ripped off. Now, the storm surge was so high that if you could, you would go to the second, third, or fourth floor, whatever, in a building or a home. And many of accounts state that if you were in a pretty sturdy house, you could look out your window or your door on the second floor. And as you see people try to pass by, you could try to pull them in. But unfortunately, all of these clothing were getting ripped off. And a lot of the women were saved by literally grabbing them by their hair and dragging them through a window or door. And that is the case. You hear that over and over and over again because that was the only thing you could grab that was really sturdy. The slippery arm, you really couldn't get a handle on. But I'll tell you what, you can pull my hair as hard as you want to get me in the window to keep me from floating away into the bay or into the ocean. So
I'd be in big trouble there, JR. I don't have any hair. So wasn't there a specific example of a woman who was pulled in by her hair?
Yes, there is a I got sent a book a few months ago, and it's about this, and unfortunately I forget her name, but it's about this tattoo artist who is famous in South Africa, Australia, and London. And his wife actually survived the 1900 storm here in Galveston. And she was pulled into a window or open door by her hair because that's all she had. She had no clothes on, pulled into an open door window. She survived the storm. And for the rest of her life, she kept, whenever she did cut her hair, she kept in a bag or a very nice box her locks of hair for the rest of her life. And her granddaughter now has those locks of hair that saved her life. But yeah, that it's crazy to think about. But another thing I did want to touch on was the role of race in this. During the storm, it's very, very interesting. Galveston has always been a very progressive city. So, of course, this is where Juneteenth happened, where enslaved people were free. Black and white, a lot of times, when you think about the South, you think about hard segregation. Galveston, I'm not saying it didn't exist and there weren't places where Black people could not go into and things, but Galveston was pretty integrated in many, many ways. So you hear differing firsthand accounts. So from some Black people who were running away to survive the storm or trying to get into homes, a lot of times they were met with open arms. But another thing you hear a lot is, and sometimes they would even segregate the Black and white people while they were riding out the storm. They would put the Black people in one room or a closet, and the white people would stay in the more sturdy room or a different room. But sometimes they would allow them to come in and join in on wherever they were surviving. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic. Sometimes even that segregation took place while pure survival is going on. So just a very interesting aspect of that.
That's crazy, and to think about that, right? Even at that moment that was going on. But yeah, so that's interesting to hear that. And when I think about this storm, they didn't know how long it was going to last. It was pitch black. It's just chaos. I mean, people are hanging off of trees and rooms, houses that were floating, overturned roofs that could break apart at any moment. There's just so many stories. Now, I did want to talk about real quickly is Dr. Klein. Hey, Isaac Klein. What happened to Isaac Klein and his family?
So Isaac Klein, where his home stood, is actually about 5 blocks away from where I'm sitting now. His home was 2, maybe 3 blocks from the beach at that time. And of course, the beach front is what got hit hardest by the storm. So his family attempted to ride out the storm as long as they possibly could in this house until the train trestle, it was like a long train trestle that extended right out over the beach, broke free from where it was. This is very late in the evening during the storm. It broke free and was making its way pretty slowly towards the house. And Isaac and his brother Joseph noticed, and they had to get out of the house. Now, unfortunately, there was nowhere to go. So they ended up leaving the house, jumping out of windows, and just jumping into the water to escape this train trestle that was going to take their house out, make their house collapse when it did, which is, of course, what happened to the home after they left the house. But unfortunately, most of them got separated. And I believe Isaac's wife was, am I right? I believe it was Isaac's wife, not Joseph's wife. So Isaac's wife was killed during the storm, and they were not able to recover her body or find her body until weeks after. And the only reason they identified her body is because of her wedding ring was still on her finger. But yeah, it's really, really sad. So Isaac Klein, just to kind of finish up Isaac's story about this. So after the storm, he stayed in Galveston for a short period and then ended up moving to New Orleans. I mean, I can imagine it'd be very hard to stay in Galveston after that devastating event. And he died in New Orleans and actually has, it's very interesting. It was buried in an unmarked grave. So his grave is not even marked in New Orleans. So very interesting.
Yeah. And I understand that he didn't necessarily have a life of like disgrace after that he went on to be pretty successful forecaster.
Mhm.
So that must have been a hard thing for him to live with for the rest
Yeah.
of his life as well. And I think he died in 1955, which really isn't, when you think of it. I mean, that wasn't much before I was born. Isaac passed away. So let's talk about the aftermath of the storm. So this storm has now it passes. There had really not been any communication with the mainland, and I'm sure that people were wondering what happened. And what did the first rescuers find when they stepped on that island?
Yeah. So right after the storm, over 3,600 buildings were completely destroyed. Most of those homes and buildings were south of Broadway, which is closest to the beach. Many roofs were caved in the downtown area. The second and third and fourth floors of these big, elaborate, glorious buildings had just completely caved in. You know, as you would exit your home after the storm surge receded, you would exit your home and just look out at this devastation. And there would be bodies entwined with the rubble of the storm, bodies everywhere. And that was kind of the thing. Now, to talk about communication with the mainland, communication was not connected or set up with the mainland until 3 or 4 days after the 1900 storm. So people in Houston who also experienced the 1900 storm, which again is 50 miles north of Galveston, they experienced the storm as well. A lot of people died in Houston because same thing. They didn't know the storm was coming. There was no communication with Houston. So no one really knew what was going on until someone had the word was relayed somehow. But another thing that was really, really bad is that the train track going up to Houston was completely destroyed. So getting trains down here was going to be a huge issue. So there was really no major rescue operation like there would be today, where you have it in almost a few hours after the storm passes through, you start getting rescue things going on. There was none of that. So Galveston had to sustain itself. The city government, whoever was still alive, the police department, the sheriff, they had to sustain themselves, and they knew that immediately because they knew as soon as their communication lines are down, as soon as the actual travel on and off the island is completely wiped out, that's a problem. So Galvestonians, what they did is they split Galveston into separate wards, and then the sheriff or the police, they would deputize respected members of the community who lived in that area, who survived the storm. They would deputize them to a certain section and say, you are in charge of crime, basically, because looting was a big deal. People, of course, died with their jewelry on and things like that, necklaces. People would go and loot all these things. Survivors, they were to be shot on the spot. So there are even photos of people being executed after the storm because of looting and things like that. So you're in charge of crime and in charge of the cleanup effort and in charge of the body recovery. And what they would do is, as they would sift through this rubble, they would start piling them up, getting mules that would have survived, putting them on putting the wood on carts and taking them to specific locations. As they would find bodies, they would take them to the downtown area, to take them to these big warehouse buildings that a lot of them are still there, and have makeshift morgues where people could go and try to find their family members. This only worked for a couple days because, as you know, after a day or two of a body that's been dead, they start bloating and smelling really bad. So there's no way this could go on for long. So this is before there was any help from the outside. So if you could or couldn't identify the bodies, they would try to catalog what they were wearing, if there was any jewelry, things like that, and then start taking the bodies to either funeral pyres or try to dump them out at sea. Unfortunately, the dumping at sea didn't work very well. A lot of the bodies washed back up on shore. So they ended up burning these bodies in funeral pyres anyway. So there were very, very few grave markers on this island. That state died during the storm, September 8th, 1900. Very, very few. There are some, but it's very interesting. The location of the nation's largest or deadliest natural disaster, and very few gravestones stating so. So After a few days, you start getting the communication to the mainland, and rescue efforts begin immediately. Hundreds of thousands of dollars start pouring in from all over the world because at this time, Galveston is a major international city. You get donations from literally every major European country. All these different organizations start pouring in. The American Red Cross and Clara Barton make their way down to Galveston, maybe a week or so after the storm. Of course, the island is only 2 miles off the coast, so you can still take boats to and from. So that's really what was happening. The city was declared under martial law, so you could not be out after dark, but a lot of people had nowhere to go. So as the Red Cross got here, they would set up tents, bring in supplies, raise money, bring in lumber or start collecting lumber that had been that was recovered from the storm and start building makeshift forts. So yeah, the American Red Cross had a huge part to play here in Galveston. And Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, that was her last major mission, was the 1900 Storm Recovery Project.
It's hard to pull a inspiring story out of this catastrophe or something to make you feel good, but I think maybe in this recovery effort, you can see that because people had to work together. I mean, there's always going to be people who are going to take advantage of the situation. You mentioned the looters, but people had to organize. They had to work together to rebuild, to comfort each other, just to help people find loved ones. I can imagine there were some very, very happy reunions of people who did find each other, and then, of course, many, many more that were the other way. But the island did rebuild, didn't it? It did rebuild, and relatively quickly. Just some of the things I wanted to touch on is the buildings that survived the storm, one of which is one that you're sitting in right now. And
right here.
Can you tell us about some of those landmarks that are still in Galveston today? And if you could just start with your own home.
Absolutely. So the home I'm sitting in right now, of course, again, if you look at a map of Galveston, I am 4.5 blocks from the beach from where I am right now. And I'm in a home built in 1886. So this home was built here on 18th and M in 1886 at the time when there was no seawall at all. So no protection from the sea. So the only reason this home survived, and many of the homes along this street, along Avenue M, survived, is because as this rubble was building up from the storm surge from the homes closest to the beach, all that rubble started to kind of pile up in the waves and then get caught on the next house, and then that house would collapse and caught on the next house and that house would collapse, building and building this pile of rubble. But what really happened there is a lot of this rubble started to build a kind of wall along Avenue M.5, which is 1 block over, M and M.5. Now that wall, of course, it didn't stop the flooding, but what it did stop was the battering of those waves straight out of the Gulf of Mexico. So it protected this entire string of homes here. So I am on the closest street to the beach to have survived the 1900 storm. Now, of course, this house was built in 1886. It is made of cypress wood, which is very, very sturdy. And the home was originally built on stilts. So Galvestonians knew there were floods and tropical storms and things like that, and it flooded all the time because the home was built on stilts. So the first floor was originally about 6 feet above the ground. So, yeah.
Not a bad place to be in, but tell us about the man who lived in your house at that time.
Yeah, so we bought this house in 2020, and we didn't really know if it had any historical significance whatsoever. A really interesting thing, I started doing some research in the Galveston city directories, where you can go back to the 1860s and see who was living at what address. And we know this home has been here since 1886. So I looked at 1900. I was just curious, who lived here during the storm and what was their experience like? Because what I was trying to do was see if there were firsthand accounts written by the people who lived here, and maybe they could talk about the storm from living in this house. I think that would be the coolest thing ever, to hear through their eyes what it was like looking out the same windows I'm looking out. But what we found out was that the man who lived here was a man named Sheriff Henry Thomas. He was the sheriff previously a mounted policeman here in Galveston, mounted on a horse, ended up making sheriff. And he became kind of famous around the island for a couple different things, one of which he helped the famous boxer, Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion of the world. He helped him throughout his entire Galveston boxing career. For those who don't know who Jack Johnson is, he's worth a Google. Definitely look up the boxer Jack Johnson. You will be amazed by his entire story. He was just pardoned back in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, for some of the things he was charged with, which were kind of crazy anyway. So he helped him. Sheriff Henry Thomas helped him while he was in jail. So he kind of helped him get out. But while he was in jail here in Galveston, he was jailed for boxing while black, boxing in an exhibition match that was not sanctioned by the city. It was because he was black. Wow. They put him in jail, and what he did, he sold tickets to a boxing exhibition inside of the jail, which was kind of fascinating. But another thing Sheriff Henry Thomas did was Galveston has in the 20th century has a history of gambling and prohibition. Just there wasn't a thing here. But what he did, they would go raid certain locations here on the island, and he's seen posing with all these bottles of liquor, and who knows what else he had going on. But really, really fascinating history. So he was the sheriff during the 1900 storm. And as I was speaking about the deputization of different areas in the city, he would have no doubt been he would have either deputized somebody in this area, or he would have been over this entire area, the cleanup efforts and things like that. So really, really fascinating.
That is, to learn something about the house you're sitting in right now. I see a window behind you that somebody could have been looking out that window at the storm and saying, hey, this is getting worse. What are we going to do? And one quick thing about the sheriff. Did you mention to me in a prior conversation that he gave some of that money from the ticket sales back to Jack Johnson?
That's what I've read. So, of course, it's really hard to confirm. These are different accounts from different things. Sometimes you got to tie things together. All I know is Jack Johnson thanked him in his autobiography for the help. So that's kind of one of those things that I pieced it together, but I can't remember exactly if that's a solid yes or solid no, but I know he was helped out quite a bit by Sheriff Henry Thomas.
Something to look into. Definitely Google Jack Johnson, incredible boxer. So your house, you talked earlier about the orphanage that is now a Target. Let's talk about the weather building, the building that was Isaac Klein's place of business. He didn't ride out the storm in that building, but he did have a worker in there, one of his employees. What happened to that building? Is it still in existence?
Yes, that building is still there. So that building is on the corner of Market Street and 23rd or Tremont Street. If you're down in Galveston, that building was originally built to be an opera house, believe it or not. It was the Tremont Opera House attached to the Tremont Hotel, which was founded while Texas was still its own republic. And the Tremont Opera House was a really beautiful opera house, but it was converted into an office building and apartments. And Galveston's National Weather Bureau, they had all their instruments on top of that building. So like you said, the anemometer, I can't even say it now, but that where it measures the speed of the wind, all of that equipment was on the roof of that building, which the building still exists. It's still there. And there are multiple landmarks like that all over the island. The Bishop's Palace on 14th Street, over 200 people survived the storm in that home. A lot of the brick buildings in the east end of Galveston, or big sturdy buildings that you see, a lot of those homes survived the 1900 storm, and many, many people survived the storm in there as well. But, you speak about landmarks. 3,600 homes and buildings were destroyed, over 3,600. But many, 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 many survive. So that's kind of the funny thing is like we imagine like this devastation, which it was completely devastated. But a lot of the buildings really did survive. And it's really, really cool to see as you go around Galveston, you look around, a lot of times you could see a little diamond-shaped plaque on the buildings that state it's a 1900 storm survivor. But not every home has that. So, yeah, I mean, many of these very, very prominent buildings that were here survived the storm, but unfortunately, a lot of them were destroyed as well. And to go back and look at old photos of these buildings that were never rebuilt or reconstructed, it really puts into perspective how important this city was and how the citizens and even the state looked at this city back in the day. So,
Yeah, let's look at the aftermath. So Galveston's history changed after that storm, didn't it? I mean, you had the recovery, the rebuilding of Galveston. A seawall was built. What was it,
Hmm.
about 17 feet, was it, or something along those lines? So they did
Yes,
build
sir.
that. But didn't they raise the whole level of the island as well?
They did. So the entire urbanized portion of Galveston Island was elevated. Now, what's the next question? How the heck did they do that?
How'd
How
they
did they
do
elevate it?
that?
Right? So of course the seawall is very impressive. The original structure of the seawall was 3 miles long, extending from about 6th Street over to 39th Street. So the idea behind elevating the island was to not only protect from the storm surge battering against the city coming forward, it was to protect from the storm surge where billions of gallons of water are flooding into Galveston Bay and coming back up onto the bay side of the island, which was a huge problem during Ike. We're seeing that now. But anyway, the grade raising was to essentially elevate the entire grade or elevation on the island. So what they did is they dredged long canals from the bayside all the way to behind the construction of the seawall and started pumping in mud where they dredged from the ship channel. So it was a really 2-part project or 3-part project. So you had the seawall, you had the grade raising, and then you had the dredging of the ship channel, which the idea was, well, we're still a port, and the deeper our water is, the larger ships we can have coming to the port. So they started pulling all the sand and mud out of the ship channel and started filling in under these houses. Now, if you were living in Galveston and your house was sitting on the ground, it was up to you over a few year period to elevate your home above where the grade was going to be raised. So Galveston is also known as the city on stilts because as they were filling in, between 17 and 8 feet of sand under your house, you had to make sure your house was elevated above that. Now, a few homes here in Galveston were too large to elevate. On Broadway, the Moody Mansion and the Bishop's Palace, they were way too big to put on stilts and elevate. So those buildings were filled in around. And it's really kind of cool to see. They almost look like they have basements, even though basements are not a thing down here. But yeah, it's a really, really fascinating project. So as they were filling in, all this sand was being compacted over time. It took over 10 years to elevate from 6th Street down to 39th Street. Many grade raisings took place after that through the 20th century farther west on the island as the seawall was extended west.
What a phenomenal accomplishment, given the tools that they had at that time. A lot of it was just, really good engineering, but a lot of hard work by people. Now, is that why your house is no longer on stilts? Was it one of those houses that just got filled in underneath and now you're on the ground?
No, actually, our house is a really funny story. It was elevated. It's been elevated 3 times from what we can see. Initially, when it was built, it was on the ground. Then it was put on stilts shortly after. And then it was elevated again just to get a little higher after the storm. And then again, in order to build out like an apartment downstairs. Yeah, so I'm sitting upstairs in the original structure of the 1886 home. So we have multiple additions on the house, kind of go with the story of Galveston as the city still expanded through the 20th century. We have an addition on the back of the house, and we have a full build out underneath me that was built in the early 1900s. So yeah, the original structure I'm sitting in that originally sat on the ground is now the 2nd floor.
That is so interesting. And we talked about the seawall and the rebuilding, but I think from what I read that Galveston did lose ground on Houston. Houston started to emerge as more the leading city. Is that true? That happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things happened. So before the 1900 storm, Houston, as we know, is the 4th largest city in the United States today. At the time, it had a population of about 45,000 in 1900, maybe a few more than that. But it was really a major railroad hub is what it was, because it was just far north enough to be north of Galveston Bay and all the swamps, connect straight over to New Orleans and connect straight over to San Antonio. That's literally where Houston is, almost right in the middle, but right above all the swampland. And it was a major railroad hub going even up to Denver and all those western cities, Dallas, Kansas City, you name it. Now, Houston had been working on a port project for decades, and that you could take small boats, even back into the 1830s, you could take small boats and barges up to darn near downtown Houston, which you can still see that today at Buffalo Bayou. Now, they were working on expanding the port of Houston, even though it was very small, even before the 1900 storm happened. But by 1914, they had dredged over 50 miles from Galveston Bay up to downtown Houston, pretty close to downtown Houston, 50 miles of a channel, opening up the Houston Ship Channel officially in 1914. Now, 1914 is a very significant date for this area because the Panama Canal was also officially opened in 1914. Now, what did that do, and how does that play into it? The Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and the Pacific, right? So you don't have to go all the way down around South America. So all of this shipping to and from Asia was now, and the West Coast was now completely open. Galveston's still recovering from the storm, and Houston really just hammering it down with all this industry and building and opening up the ship channel along with that Panama Canal expansion. It was way cheaper to ship directly to Houston, where those railroad hubs are, than it was to ship to Galveston and then transload it up to Houston and then ship out elsewhere. So Galveston is still a port today, still a very major port, but nowhere close to the amount of economic impact that Houston has.
And a lot of that potentially related to that storm in 1900. Wow, I tell you, I don't know. Actually, I do some substitute teaching, and I see these books. It's a series. I think it's called I Survived. And they have little historic books about big historic events. They have the Titanic. There was a couple others they had, but I saw one of the kids with the Galveston Storm book. So I was glad that little kids are able to learn that there are some significant things in history that were difficult, but I think difficult's an understatement, but terrible events, I should say, but how people came together to help others and to rebuild. I think that's the big message there. And of course, weather forecasting has come a long way. Galveston would have had a lot more warning, and people most likely would have had the opportunity to get off the island and get to safety. But I could just keep on going here. But here's the thing. You and I, and my wife Kelly and I met you at PodFest last January down in Orlando. And your enthusiasm for history, and particularly the history of Galveston, Texas, just came out. Kelly and I were talking on the way home and saying, man, we got to talk to JR. And I know what I want to talk to him about. And you and I, we've had some other conversations, and you just love what you're doing. And you have a fantastic podcast. I mentioned it before, called Galveston Unscripted. You sort of take people through Galveston and talk about the history. And you're doing a lot of other stuff. Can you tell our listeners about your podcast and what's your mission by doing this? And what plans do you have for the future?
Yeah, perfect. So the Galveston Unscripted you see today, it's a couple different things. So we have a YouTube channel where it's all pretty short videos where I take you through different aspects of history, not only Galveston history, but American and Texas history mainly, and tie it to little bits of things we could see today in Galveston. That's the video aspect. The podcast aspect of it is I have pretty short audio guides, essentially, for people who are either visiting Galveston or people who live here who really want to understand some context on something, but don't quite know it. And they're not really going to go read it somewhere or really get into a Google search. But I created the short podcast episodes so people could find quick history on something specific here in Galveston. And I try to cover as many different aspects of history as possible with that. I also interview people on the podcast. I think we have like 30 something interviews on there, long form, similar to this, where we're just deep diving into different aspects of history. Now, it doesn't all pertain directly to Galveston. Of course, we're just in Galveston while we're recording it, but we talk about everything and kind of how it ties to what we can see today. But yeah, so that all started out of a little audio guide project I started a couple years ago. But really what I'm trying to do now, what I'm doing now is working with different organizations across the state, and even some other states, and helping these historical organizations who don't quite have the expertise or the budget to build a podcast or start a podcast or build an audio tour, and help them or show them how I did it, because I did it with, just time, honestly, time and very inexpensive software and very inexpensive equipment like this microphone. But yeah, no, that's what I'm doing now. And it's really, really fun. I've got a few partnerships, quite a few sponsors for a lot of the things I'm working on now. So it's a real fun journey. I'm just passionate about history. I want younger people to be interested in history, at least enough to understand the context of what is being discussed or where we live and where we are today.
I think that's great. And you are a wonderful storyteller. And that's what our podcast is all about, really telling stories, and stories that will educate people. And clearly, Galveston is part of your story because you were born there. You have a passion for the city and you're educating people, and it's fun. Obviously, the storm was a tragedy, but learning about it and learning about the people who were involved and how they survived, some of them, how some of them had to grieve, and the rebuilding process, when you realize that so much stuff got done in the rebuilding process that it just came from blood, sweat, and tears from people. Many of those workers were people who were also dealing with personal tragedies, and they had to feed their families. They didn't have the luxury of maybe just moving somewhere else and moving in with other people. They just had to start from zero. And I think we take that for granted. There are people, Americans, who went through this. So I think it's important for people to learn the story and, how Americans had come together to help each other in times of tragedy. So thank you for telling the story. How can people find out more about your podcast and what you're up to?
Yeah, so on any podcast platform, you could check out Galveston Unscripted. Just give it a search. It should be the first thing that pops up. The website where I have the free audio tour. So every podcast I transform into an audio guide. So it's galvestonunscripted.com. You could just Google it. And then we have a YouTube channel, which I am really diving into and getting into. Every week, every Tuesday, we have a new video that comes out, and I try to tie as many aspects of history into it as possible. But that's Galveston Unscripted on everything. So we're everywhere.
And we'll be posting those links to this episode as well. But JR, thank you so much for your time and for telling us this incredible story and just really giving us this information so that we can look up some of this stuff ourselves. But I think what you're doing is great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I did want to say one thing. If anyone's listening, please go try to find firsthand accounts. There are recorded firsthand accounts of the 1900 storm. And actually any disaster that you can think of, try to find those firsthand accounts and listen to them. It really puts into perspective what they had to deal with and how they got through. And even a lot of times those firsthand accounts were recorded 100 years ago. After that account, they didn't talk about it too much sometimes. So we don't always know these tidbits of information. They may have recorded it once and they don't really talk about it. So definitely look up some firsthand accounts on different disasters. It's really, really interesting to see and hear.
Great advice. Good information, JR. Thank you so much.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay.
We'll talk soon.
Okay, we will. Definitely. Thanks.
All right, later. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.